I am just one of thousands of scientists today, and the number is growing rapidly, who have become convinced that the theory of evolution is scientifically untenable, and that the concept of spatial creation much more admirably correlates and explains the evidence related to origins. I want to say, first of all, about this issue of creation and evolution, that ultimately neither evolution nor creation is a scientific theory. Because you see, the first criterion of a scientific theory or any process is that the processes or events or properties that you use to support your theory must be observable, and repeatedly so. However, we realize, of course, that there were no human observers to the origin of the universe or the origin of life, or as a matter of fact, to the origin of a single living thing. These events were unique historical events that occurred in the past, and that's not the stuff of science, that's the stuff of history. Of course, there is evidence available today from which we can infer support for either creation or evolution. So evolution and creation then are inferences based upon circumstantial evidence. Neither, of course, is capable of proof, but I believe we can attain a high degree of confidence and credibility in the concept of creation based upon scientific evidence and scientific evidence alone. Let me define what I mean by creation and evolution. By evolution, I am referring to this notion, to this idea that the universe and all that it contains, including all living things, of course, have arisen by naturalistic, mechanistic processes which we can ascribe to properties inherent in matter. Now, according to this theory, whether one believes in God or not is, of course, immaterial. According to the theory, no outside intervention of any kind was required or permitted, as a matter of fact. By definition, God or any other outside agency is excluded. Matter was sufficient to do it all. As the late Professor Harlow Shapley said, some people piously proclaim, in the beginning God. I say, in the beginning hydrogen. And Professor Shapley maintained that starting with hydrogen and the laws of science now operating and billions of years of time, one could explain the origin of everything. Of course, he could do no such thing, but the notion, the idea was consistent with his philosophy. I'm reminded that someone has said that hydrogen is an odorless, tasteless, invisible gas, which, if given sufficient time, becomes people. Now, that is precisely what evolutionists do believe, because shortly after the postulated Big Bang, the only thing in the entire universe was this expanding cloud of hydrogen. And now, of course, today we have, it is estimated, 100 billion galaxies, each with 100 billion stars, and we have our complex solar system, and of course millions of complex living things, all having been derived from hydrogen during these billions of years of time. Now the creation scientists said, no, that's not possible. In the light of known scientific laws and processes, this universe could not have created itself naturally. Therefore, it had to be created supernaturally. The creation scientist says, from our study of chemical thermodynamics and kinetics, the laws of probability, and many other areas of science, we can know that life could not have arisen spontaneously through the processes of chemistry and physics. We can exclude, absolutely exclude that possibility. Then again, you see, we can conclude that life had to be created supernaturally. And then when we take a look at the evidence related to living things, we believe the evidence compels us to accept direct spatial creation. The creation scientist then says that the universe and everything it contains had to be created by something or someone external to the universe. Therefore, what we call supernatural, a supernatural creator. We believe that this creator, or God as we refer to him, God created this universe directly. He created stars and planets, he created our solar system, and he created each one of the basic kinds, the basic types of plants, and animals, what we call the created kind. The creation scientist says that none of these basic types or created kinds were derived from a common ancestor, but that they had a separate origin. Now, these are the two basic models of origins. Of course, within each model, there are submodels. For example, among evolutionists, there are still some who cling to Lamarckianism, the idea of inheritance of acquired characteristics. The current orthodoxy, however, is the so-called neo-Darwinian theory of evolution, that evolution has occurred very slowly and gradually through a vast stretch of time. Then we have a new concept called punctuated equilibrium. According to this concept, evolution proceeds in a jerky fashion. And then there's a hopeful monster mechanism by which it was suggested a reptile laid an egg and a bird was hatched from the egg. And so we have various submodels within evolution, as we have within creation. There are those creationists called recent creationists. They believe that creation took place rather recently in a very short span of time, and within that model they also include catastrophism, including catastrophism on a worldwide scale, possibly including a worldwide flood. Also among the creationists we find the progressive creationists. Progressive creationists say, well, the earth really is very old. God created the earth maybe 4.5 or 5 billion years ago. He created life maybe 3 billion years ago. He created the invertebrates 600, 700 million years ago, and fishes about 50 million years later or so, and various other animals at various stages of history. And finally, within the perhaps the past few 100,000 years, he created man. The progressive creationists. And there are a few other subdivisions we might include within this basic creation model. But the basic question, you see, is this: how did this universe come into being? How did living things originate? Did they come into being through some mechanistic, naturalistic process? Or were they supernaturally created? That's the two basic models, and that's what we would like to discuss today. Now, if, as evolutionists say, the universe began with some primordial explosion, some big bang, and shortly afterwards there was nothing in the universe but this cloud of hydrogen, and now we have this vastly complex universe, then, you see, we could make certain predictions about the properties of matter. Now, if that has happened, matter must have this inherent ability to transform itself from disorder to order, from the simple to the complex. For that is the way that evolution has proceeded. And it has created this incredibly complex universe with these unbelievably complex living creatures from nothing but hydrogen. On the other hand, if creation is true, we'd predict no such thing. Matter could not promote itself to higher and higher levels of organization and complexity. We might detect precisely the opposite tendency. If something has happened since creation to alter the original created state, it could only lead to a deteriorative process or a downward process, but never the reverse. Now let us go out there in the real world, take a look, and see what we find. Do we find that matter has this inherent capability of transforming itself from disorder to order? Do we have a natural law or a set of natural laws today which describes such properties of matter? Or what do we find going on out there in the real world? Well, let me point out first of all, we do not have a natural law or a set of natural laws which describes an intrinsic ability of matter to transform itself from disorder to order, from the simple to the complex. There is no such natural law, but there is a natural law which describes exactly the opposite tendency. Throughout the entire universe, whether we're speaking on the scale of the galaxies, or stars, or here on Earth, our machines, our bodies, our houses, or down to the level of the atom, we find a universal natural tendency to go from order to disorder, from the complex to the simple. For example, we see this statement by Isaac Asimov, which he published in June of 1970 in the Smithsonian Institute Journal. Isaac Asimov is an evolutionist. He believes, in spite of this difficulty, in spite of this fact, that somehow evolution has occurred. But let's see now what the facts are. Isaac Asimov says, and I quote, "Another way of stating the second law, then, is the universe is constantly getting more disorderly. Viewed that way, we can see the second law all about us. We have to work hard to straighten a room, but left to itself, it becomes a mess again very quickly and very easily. Even if we never enter it, it becomes dusty and musty. How difficult to maintain houses and machinery and our own bodies in perfect working order. How easy to let them deteriorate. In fact, all we have to do is nothing, and everything deteriorates, collapses, breaks down, wears out, all by itself. And that is what the second law is all about." Now, what Isaac Asimov is referring to here is the second law of thermodynamics, one of the most well-established laws known in science. Now, if that is what the second law of thermodynamics is all about, we see that indeed evolution is in trouble. We have a tremendous difficulty. You see, evolution, the theory of evolution postulates that we've had this universal process going from disorder to order. The second law of thermodynamics says there's a universal process, a universal tendency in all systems to go from order to disorder. As a matter of fact, as Isaac Asimov has said, the present universe, right now, in real time, empirically, we find that the universe is deteriorating, it's wearing out, it's running down. And unless God intervenes, it has one certain destiny: the universe is going to die. It's going to suffer what they call a heat death. It will reach a time when all the fuel and all the stars has been exhausted. The universe will grow cold and dark, and that's the end of everything. Now, my question is this: if the natural laws and natural processes that are now operating in this universe are leading inexorably to its destruction, to the elimination of all complexity and information in this universe, and if those natural laws are all there is and all there ever has been, how then could those very same natural laws create this universe in the first place? That couldn't be possible. The very natural processes destroying the universe created it in the first place? No. The creation scientist says that is totally unscientific. That's anti-scientific to believe such a thing. To believe that is to believe a myth. It is contrary to the known laws of science. Now, if this second law of thermodynamics says anything, it says this: if you have an isolated system, now you understand an isolated system is a system on which no work is being performed by anything on the outside. It's a system into which nothing is being brought in from the outside. In that case, only one thing can happen in that isolated system. It will deteriorate or run down, become less orderly, more random. It will never, absolutely never, become more ordered and more complex. But evolutionists believe that this universe is an isolated system. Whether you believe in God or not is immaterial. He didn't do any work on the system. He didn't bring anything in from outside. It was a process of self-transformation. And what happened in this isolated system? Well, we start with that cosmic egg. Where did that cosmic egg come from? How did it get there? No one has the foggiest notion. There it was. And then it exploded. What did the universe look like shortly after that Big Bang? Well, this is what it looked like. You wouldn't see anything. All you have is an expanding cloud of hydrogen. There are no stars. There are no galaxies. No solar system. No nothing. Just an expanding cloud of hydrogen. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if that's all that ever happened, If this cloud of hydrogen continued to expand forever, we'd have no problem with the second law of thermodynamics. But that's not what happened in the evolutionary scenario, you see. We have this star cluster, thousands of stars, each one extremely complex. And we have galaxies. And it is believed that each galaxy contains 100 billion stars. And we have 100 billion galaxies. There's 100 billion times 100 billion concentrations of matter in our universe, each at a very high temperature, millions of degrees. And then we have our own solar system, and this is a montage of Jupiter and its moons. Very complicated system. Our solar system is very complicated. And of course, living things on Earth, here on Earth, are incredibly complex. So there has been, according to the evolutionary scenario, a natural transformation from simple to complex, from disorder to order within the universe, an isolated system which must obey the second law of thermodynamics, according to everything we know in science today. This idea, then, that the universe has created itself is contrary to the facts and the laws of science. And listen to what some of the cosmologists are saying. IBM's Philip E. Seiden, in a publication in Science, that is in Science 81, June of last year, said, and I quote, "The standard Big Bang model does not give rise to lumpiness." Now let me just interject here. By lumpiness, he means galaxies and stars. They're cosmic lumps. He says the standard Big Bang model does not give rise to lumpiness. That model assumes the universe started out as a globally smooth, homogeneous, expanding gas. If you apply the laws of physics to this model, you get a universe that is uniform, a cosmic vastness of evenly distributed atoms with no organization of any kind. No galaxies, no stars, no planets, no nothing. Now that, end of quote, now that is what we would predict on the basis of the model and the laws of science. You would not get the universe that we have today. And that is supported by Sir Fred Hoyle, the famous British astronomer, who has been an atheist and an evolutionist almost his entire life. But there have been some remarkable changes in that man's life just recently. He says in this article, published in New Scientist, November 19 of last year, titled "The Big Bang in Astronomy." Now, discussing this Big Bang, Sir Fred makes the following statement. After the Big Bang, he says, "But the interesting quark transformations are almost immediately over and done with, to be followed by a rather simple nuclear physics, to be followed by what? By a dull as ditch water expansion, which degrades itself adiabatically until it is incapable of doing anything at all. The notion that galaxies form to be followed by active astronomical history is an illusion. Nothing forms. The thing is as dead as a doornail." End of quote. Now, I think that is so interesting. A man who speculated evolutionary ideas on the origin of the universe for so many years has finally concluded on the basis of science that this Big Bang theory would produce nothing. Well, you might get hydrogen, but you see, as he said, then from then on, it's dull as ditch water. It just expands forever. You would never get galaxies and stars and things like that. So we see then now, taking the concept of evolution, all possible scenarios that can be suggested. It is not that they just haven't quite yet hit on the right idea, you see, the right notion. You take any mechanistic, naturalistic theory, apply the laws of physics, and you cannot get the universe we have today. Our universe had to be created by something external to the universe, by this supernatural creator. Now let us leave this area and go to the area of probability. The probability laws operating today in view of the tremendous complexity and information content of even the simplest cell simply destroys the notion of evolution. Now here we see in this diagram the sequence, the amino acid sequence of ribonuclease. A ribonuclease is just an average protein, or actually much smaller than an average protein. It has 124 amino acids. The average protein has about 400 amino acids. And even for the most primitive living cell imaginable, we would have to have thousands, at least hundreds, perhaps thousands of different enzymes and thousands of very complex DNA and RNA molecules. Now, the particular biological activity possessed by each one of these molecules is due to the particular sequence of the subunits. You know, when you write a message in any language, you have to arrange the letters of the alphabet in precise order in order to spell words and make sentences and to produce the message. The same is true here. Now, if we just calculate the probability that by chance, through chemistry and physics, we would just happen to get the right sequence of these amino acids in order to have an enzyme on one hand, or human growth hormone on the other hand, or the protein associated with our red blood cells, that is hemoglobin, or something like that. If one would calculate the probability of those things coming together by chance, you will find that the probability of getting one single molecule in 1 billion years, 5 billion years, or what, is just simply nil. But you must have billions of tons of each one of these protein molecules and billions of tons each of DNA and RNA molecules to have a ghost of a chance for the origin of life. Now, scientists have been working on this problem, particularly in the last few years. One of these scientists is Hubert P. Yockey. Dr. Yockey is not either a creationist nor an evolutionist. He's a scientist, just worked on the problem. Utilizing information theory, the information content of living cells, and the processes that supposedly gave rise to these living cells, and utilizing probability laws, Dr. Yockey calculated the probability of spontaneous biogenesis, that is, a spontaneous origin of life. It's just simply impossible. Here are the conclusions that he reached. We see that in this statement taken from his article that appeared in the Journal of Theoretical Biology, volume 67, 1977. Beginning on page 377, we see the statement by Dr. Yockey, which reads as follows, and I quote, "The longest genome, that is the longest gene, which could be expected with 95% confidence in 10 to the 9th years, that is 1 billion years, corresponds to only 49 amino acid residues." He goes on to say this is much too short to code a living system, so evolution to higher forms could not get started. Now let me interject here. What is he saying? The best you could get by chance in 1 billion years is one single gene that would code for a protein of only 49 amino acids. Now, you don't even get a protein with 49 amino acids. You certainly could not get a living system, a living cell with only one protein. You'd have to have thousands of protein molecules, thousands of DNA and RNA, but you can't even get one in essence in 1 billion years. So he says, you can't even get a start on the origin of life. Well, you're light years short. You see, you're not even anywhere near it. No amount of manipulation or adjusting could get you anywhere near the origin of life. Dr. Yockey goes on to say, therefore, geological evidence for the warm little pond is missing. It is concluded that belief in currently accepted scenarios of spontaneous biogenesis is based on faith, contrary to conventional wisdom. End of quote. Conventional wisdom is what you find in your textbooks, what you see in all the Time Life publications and things of that nature, that life spontaneously arose on this planet. He said there's no scientific basis for such an assumption. And in a later article he published in 1981 in the Journal of Theoretical Biology, this is volume 91, and I'm quoting from page 29 of that article, Dr. Yockey says, and I quote, "Since scientists have not the vaguest idea how life originated on Earth, whether life exists anywhere else, or whether little green men pullulate in our galaxy, it would be honest to admit this to students, the agencies funding research, and the public. Leaders in science, speaking ex cathedra, should stop polarizing the minds of students and younger scientists with statements for which faith is the only evidence." End of quote. Well, faith is all right. Nothing wrong with faith as long as it's a reasonable faith, as long as it follows your basic assumptions. The assumptions of these evolutionists is that you can explain this on the basis of science, and there is no basis, absolutely contrary evidence, that you could derive a living cell by some natural process. And this is just a small part of the problem. There are other facets of the problem, even on the level of the amino acid, or if you're trying to derive sugars. These are very simple things compared to protein, but you could not even get a significant quantity of amino acids or sugars by any plausible primitive Earth scenario. The problem is this. Yes, you can generate a little bit of a sugar or an amino acid by electrical discharge or by ultraviolet light or something like that. But unless you trap out that product, unless you remove it from the energy source, it will be destroyed at rates that enormously exceed the rate of formation. The rates of destruction are 1,000,000 times or greater than the rate of formation. And you'll never get a significant quantity of product unless you have a trap in your apparatus that traps out the product and removes it from the energy source. Well, unfortunately, there were no organic chemists on the primitive Earth to do this. And there is no natural way to trap out any material like this, but if there were, that would also be fatal to any origin of life experiment. Because you see, the idea is, if you're trying to generate some of these substances by ultraviolet light, by electrical discharges, these are raw energy, terribly destructive. If you're trying to succeed as an organic chemist, you put a trap in your apparatus. Remove the product as rapidly as it's formed. Then it gradually accumulates, you see. It's preserved from destruction. But the problem is this. That's the end of the line. You're dead. You can't go to the next step in the origin of life, you see. If you're going to combine those amino acids to form a protein, you have to supply energy. Those chemical bonds do not want to form. They do not form spontaneously. You've got to get over a thermodynamic barrier to form those chemical bonds. So you have to supply energy. But if you supply energy, what happens? You destroy your amino acids at rates that exceed thousands, millions, billions of times the rate at which you form the protein. And so with energy, the evolutionist is dead, and without it, he is dead. There is no way to get around that basic problem. We conclude then, as scientists, and I've only mentioned a few of the difficulties, we are convinced on the basis of science, life could never have arisen spontaneously by any natural process on this earth. It had to be created. Now, may I point out that this conclusion is not based upon religion, or not the conclusions of Yaki was not based upon religion, but based upon science. And we find the same conclusion as we see in this newspaper article reached by two famous scientists. As you see, the headlines say, two skeptical scientists put their heads together and reach an amazing conclusion. There must be a God. Who were these two scientists? Were there scientists that were brought into the fundamentalist camp by belief in the Bible or the belief in the book of Genesis? No, not at all. They were both atheists at the time they reached these conclusions. Who were these two scientists? One was Sir Fred Hoyle, the British astronomer, England's foremost scientist, and a friend, Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe, mathematician and astronomer at the University College, Cardiff. Been a lifelong atheist, both of these men. They became interested in the subject of the origin of life a number of years ago by utilizing the information content of living cells, by utilizing probability laws and their knowledge of mathematics. They calculated the probability that life could have arisen spontaneously on this earth. They concluded that if this earth is 5 billion years old, the probability of getting life on this earth would be 1 chance out of 1, followed by the number 1 or 10 raised to the 40,000th power. That's 1 chance out of 1 followed by 40,000 zeros. Now, that number is so immense, it's so huge, it's so large that it is zero, nil, absolutely no probability whatsoever that life could have arisen on this planet by the processes of chemistry and physics. So they said, well, let us assume the universe has 100 billion galaxies. Each galaxy has 100 billion stars, and each star has a planet like the Earth. And the universe is 20 billion years old. Let's recalculate. What would be the probability that somewhere in the universe life could have arisen by chemistry and physics? Their calculations showed that it was still essentially nil for all practical purposes. There was no probability whatsoever. Now, these two scientists, convinced by the nature of the scientific evidence alone, concluded that life could not have arisen spontaneously by even any evolutionary process imaginable, and therefore it had to be created, therefore there must be a God. Now, that is what we creation scientists have been saying for many, many years. We have published books and literature utilizing probability arguments, thermodynamics, chemical kinetics, and other arguments. Nobody has paid much attention to us. But now here is England, #1 scientist, saying the same thing. And now we must listen. These two scientists, you see, were atheists at the time. They didn't accept this idea because they had been converted to a belief in the Bible, the book of Genesis, or anything like that, but strictly on the basis of science. Now, another scientist who has indicated he's had some sort of a change like that is Dr. H.S. Lipson. He published an article in the Bulletin, the Physics Bulletin of Britain, volume 31, 1980. It's entitled "A Physicist Looks at Evolution." Dr. Lipson at University of Manchester said he got a little suspicious of the theory of evolution because it has become a scientific religion. So he thought he'd compare the biological evidence of the last 30 years to Darwinism to see if it fit in. He says, I do not believe that it does. Then he compared thermodynamics to evolution. He concluded there's a contradiction there. And he considered some alternatives. Finally, he says, now I'm quoting from his article, he says, I think, however, that we must go further than this and admit that the only acceptable explanation is creation. I know that this is anathema to physicists, as indeed it is to me, but we must not reject a theory we do not like if the experimental evidence supports it. End of quote. Now, let me point out again, Dr. Lipson did not come to this conclusion because of religion. As a matter of fact, he says the idea is anathema to me. I don't want to believe it. I don't like it. But he says, I believe it, the only reasonable alternative. Now, it is, I think, so interesting that more and more scientists today are coming to conclusions similar to these. Apparently, 100 years of Darwinism is sufficient. And it has not been able to prove its basic, establish its basic postulate. It has not been able to produce the evidence supporting it. And now scientists are beginning to see the fatal flaws in it. Now let us turn to the fossil record itself. If evolution is true, then of course the fossil record must begin with simple things which gradually transform themselves to more and more complex things. If, as evolutionists believe, millions of species have gradually evolved during hundreds of millions of years of time, then the fossil record must be overflowing with these transitional forms. Our museums must be full of these intermediate types. Why, there'd be no problem whatsoever of finding undoubted transitional forms. There would be no debate, there would be no question, there would be no creationist, because evolution would be beyond the shadow of a doubt. We'd have so many of these transitional forms. Just think of it. Millions of species evolving through hundreds of millions of years of time, it should leave an undoubted proof in the fossil record. On the other hand, if creation is true, we'd expect the fossil record to show a sudden explosion of very highly complex creatures for which we've never been able to find ancestors. We should be able to find fossils of each one of the basic types, or what we'd call the created kind, without these intermediate or transitional forms. Now you see the predictions based upon creation are very different from those based upon evolution. Let's go out now in the real world, dig up the fossils, look at them, and see if it produces the evidence predicted on the basis of evolution or creation. Well, what we find is that record is remarkably in accord with creation. We do find that very complex living things appear explosively, suddenly, with no transitional forms whatsoever, or ancestors. For example, in this slide we see animals, that is a reconstruction of animals found in what is called Cambrian rocks. Now, regardless of when these things appeared, when it was, how long ago, or how these fossils formed, we find this tremendous assemblage of very complex creatures. For example, we see the sponges, jellyfish, trilobites, sea urchins, sea cucumbers, brachiopods, worms, sea lilies. These creatures are very highly complex, so complex evolutionists believe their origin required about 2 billion years. Now, if these things have evolved from some single-cell organism, then in the rocks which generally underlie these so-called Cambrian rocks, what we call Precambrian rocks, in those Precambrian rocks, which, by the way, evolutionists believe were laid down during tens and hundreds of millions of years before the Cambrian rocks, and many of them are undisturbed, perfectly suitable for the preservation of fossils. Then if we have had this evolution from single cell to these creatures, in those Precambrian rocks, then we must find the evolutionary ancestors of those creatures. What do we find in Precambrian rocks? Well, I'll tell you what we don't find. Nowhere on the face of this earth have we found ancestors for a single one of these creatures. We've never found ancestors for the sponges, jellyfish, brachiopods, sea urchins, trilobites, none of these things. What we have, you see, in those Precambrian rocks are many, many reports of the fossils of little single-celled, soft-bodied, microscopic creatures. And if we can find fossils of little soft-bodied microscopic creatures, surely we could find fossils of everything in between those creatures and these complex invertebrates, but we find nothing. There are no transitional forms. Things do pop into existence, fully formed precisely as predicted on the basis of creation. Now it is suggested that one of these invertebrates evolved into a fish. Maybe it was a jellyfish. Maybe it was a worm. Maybe it was a brachiopod. Maybe it was a starfish, something like that. Gave rise to fishes. Fishes are vertebrates. They have an internal skeleton with soft outer part. What a tremendous transformation. About 100 million years involved in this transformation, we are told. Well, if that's the case, of course our museums, surely they are just overflowing with these transitional forms, showing the undoubted link between some invertebrate and the fishes. What do we find? Not a single transitional form is found anywhere in the fossil record. Fishes appear abruptly without any intermediate forms or ancestors. For example, we see this statement from Dr. Errol White, found in the Proceedings of the Linnaean Society of London, published in 1966. Dr. White is an evolutionist. He's an expert on fishes. Now, this article is about lungfishes. Now, listen to what Dr. White has to say in this article. He says, but whatever ideas authorities may have on the subject, the lungfishes, like every other major group of fishes that I know, have their origin firmly based in nothing. Now, nothing means nothing. Suddenly these fishes appear, you see, with no ancestors, no transitional form. Now that's precisely what we predict on the basis of creation, but it's a great embarrassment to evolutionists. And the three major subdivisions of bony fishes, for example, they appear simultaneously. They are diverse morphologically, very different from one another, and they have bony armor plates, easily fossilizable. Now, why do these three major divisions of bony fishes appear simultaneously, already highly diverse, very different from one another? And why is there no trace of any earlier intermediate forms? The evolutionist has no answer. He has no reasonable answer whatsoever for that. The fishes do appear suddenly fully formed, and that is, again, precisely what we'd expect on the basis of creation, but highly contradictory to evolutionary theory. Now, we have some statements by some well-known evolutionists. Dr. Kitts, we see in this statement on the screen, this is his statement from Evolution, Volume 28, 1974. Dr. Kitts is an evolutionist. He's an expert on the fossil record. He's not on our side, but listen to what he has to say. And this article is about the gaps or the problems of absence of transitional forms. Dr. Kitts, professor of geology at the University of Oklahoma, says, quote, despite the bright promise that paleontology provides a means of seeing evolution, it has presented some nasty difficulties for evolutionists, the most notorious of which is the presence of gaps in the fossil record. Evolution requires intermediate forms between species, and paleontology does not provide them. End of quote. All right, what does Dr. Kitts say? He says, although evolution requires intermediate forms, the fossil record does not produce them. Now, why is Dr. Kitts an evolutionist? Well, certainly not because of the fossil record, but in spite of that fossil record. What about the origin of man? We see these highly imaginative transition forms published in our textbooks, Time, Life, and so forth and so on. Well, there's a man who has spent a lifetime of research in this field with a team of scientists. He's not a creationist, but he gives his honest analysis of that evidence following this lifetime of research. Who is that man? Dr. Solly Zuckerman, for many years the head of the Department of Anatomy at the University of Birmingham in England. He became Sir Solly Zuckerman and finally became Lord Zuckerman in recognition of his distinguished scientific career. In his book, Beyond the Ivory Tower, published in 1970, on page 64, we find the following conclusion by Lord Zuckerman. Lord Zuckerman says, I quote, no scientist could logically dispute the proposition that man, without having been involved in any act of divine creation, evolved from some ape-like creature in a very short space of time, speaking in geological terms, without leaving any fossil traces of the steps of the transformation. End of quote. All right, you see what Lord Zuckerman is saying? He says, now if we set aside the possibility of creation, if we exclude that possibility, then obviously man must have evolved from some ape-like creature. But if he did, he hasn't left a trace of that evolution in the fossil record. In other words, he says, there is no evidence in the fossil record that man has evolved from some ape-like creature. Now, following that, the creature that is so often today as evidence for man's evolution is the Australopithecines. Don Johansson's Lucy, Dr. Leakey's Ginjanthropus, or East Africa man, some creatures like that, they are within this group Australopithecus. And that has been touted as man's evolutionary ancestor. Don Johansson says, for example, his Lucy is ape from the neck up, but she walked upright. So you got a bipedal ape, that is an ape that walks upright. So he's on his way to becoming people. And that is what is generally accepted and taught in all of our schools. However, Lord Zuckerman, after his many years of research on those creatures, and he studied creatures supposedly 1 million to 2 million years more recent, and therefore should be more advanced than the creatures studied by Johansson. He concluded that these creatures did not walk upright. They were not intermediate between ape and man at all. A former student of his, Dr. Charles Oxnard, now at the University of Southern California, has done many years of research on these creatures, on the pelvis, foot bones, hand bones, knee bones, and all of these structures. And he has concluded the evidence indicates that they walked or had a mode of locomotion similar to an orang. They did not walk upright like man, and they were not intermediate between ape and man. Now we see, for example, in this picture here we have on the screen, we see on the right, this is taken from one of the papers by Charles Oxnard, published in American Biology Teacher, May of 1979. On the right, in the upper portion of the slide, we see the pelvis of Australopithecus. In the middle, the two human pelves. On the left, the pelvis of a chimpanzee. And obviously, in this view, the pelvis of Australopithecus does look more like man than it does look like the ape on the left. But now Charles Oxnard says, let's just rotate that pelvis. So we're looking at it at a different angle. Now we see what we see in the lower portion of the slide. On the right, again, the pelvis of Australopithecus. In the middle, the two human pelves. On the left, the pelvis of a chimpanzee. Now what does that pelvis look like? Why, almost exactly like that of the ape and very unlike that of man. And Dr. Oxnard pointed out, if you continue to do that, rotate the pelvis to many different orientations, you will find that that pelvis is not intermediate between ape and man, that the creature did not walk upright. What do we usually get in the classroom? The upper set. You see, that illustration supposedly demonstrates that that creature walked upright. It did not walk upright. It's not intermediate between ape and man. It is not evidence for human evolution. Now we have the famous evolution of the horse. Now, scientists today know that the standard picture we see in our textbooks on the evolution of horse is not correct, that these things are not arranged in the order they're found at all. Well, yes, we did have different kind of horses, but we have no transitional form, and evolutionists say that. They do believe that horses did evolve, and true, but they have to admit that we have no transitional forms. Now, in this picture on the left, and I took this from a book by Alfred Romer called Vertebrate Paleontology. On the left, we see the view of the hind feet of horses in North America. On the left, we see the Eohippus, supposedly the first horse. Nobody really knows whether it's a horse or not. But it's supposedly the first horse, three-toed horse. On the right, the one-toed modern horse, and in the middle, Murray-Kippus, which is supposed to be a horse now extinct that had three toes indeed, but reduced side toes. There you see a rather logical, natural progression from three-toed to one-toed. That's what's taught to all of our school children. Now, on the right, from a different section of the book, I found that picture of the South American subungulates, or horse-like creatures, down in South America. Well, first of all, let me point out again, Professor Romer arranged those feet in that order. Three toes on the left, one-toed on the middle, and the three-toed with reduced side toes in the middle, just as he had done the North American horses. But reading the text, I found that according to the geological column and the interpretation, the way these things are found, that down in South America, the one-toed horse is found first, and the three-toed horse occurs later. The fact is, it does not occur until the one-toed horses become extinct. Now, if you believe in North America, based upon that evidence, a three-toed horse evolved into a one-toed horse, using the same logic, the same reasoning, the same type of scientific evidence, you would have to believe that in South America, a one-toed horse evolved into a three-toed horse. Why don't they teach that? Well, you see, it's so contradictory to the idea that they've always taught. So they just don't teach it. They don't even mention it. And may I emphasize that in neither case do they have transitional form. And finally, we see the picture of Archaeopteryx. Ah, here surely is a transitional form. Here we have this famous Archaeopteryx, which according to evolutionists has features of both reptiles and birds. Well, first of all, we note that Archaeopteryx was indeed a bird. It had feathers identical to the feathers of modern birds. And by the way, they were feathers of flying birds, indicated that this creature did fly. We see that he had wings, he had perching feet, he was a bird. And there are no transitional forms between this bird and any reptile or this bird and any other bird. He stands in marvelous isolation. Now, he did have a few what they call reptilian characteristics. He had teeth, for example, had claws on the wings, and a few other features. May I point out that there's several birds today that have claws on the wings, including the ostrich, including the turaco of Africa, and the hoatzin of South America. And the presence or absence of teeth proves nothing about ultimate ancestry, because in every subclass of vertebrates, some have teeth, some do not. Some fishes have teeth, some do not. Some amphibians have teeth, some do not. Some reptiles have teeth, some do not. Most mammals have teeth, but some do not. And it was in this case too. Some birds had teeth and some did not. Archaeopteryx was a bird. Recently they have found fossils of modern type birds contemporary with Archaeopteryx, which tends to support our conclusion this bird was not an intermediate, not a transitional form, but was indeed a bird. And we find that Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard University, Niles Eldredge of the American Museum, both convinced evolutionists, have some doubts in some ways about Archaeopteryx. In an article they published in Paleobiology, Volume 3, 1977, this is from page 147, they say at the higher level of evolutionary transition between basic morphological designs, gradualism has always been in trouble, though it remains the official position of Western evolutionists. Smooth intermediates between Bauplana. Now, Bauplana is a German word for these basic morphological design. Basic morphological design, the basic types, the created kinds of the creations. Smooth intermediates between Bauplana are almost impossible to construct, even in thought experiments. There is certainly no evidence for them in the fossil record. Parenthesis, curious mosaics like Archaeopteryx do not count. Parenthesis. End of quote. Now, of course, I cannot be certain what these gentlemen are thinking, but they say the idea that we go from one basic type to another through a smooth series of intermediates, that's always been in trouble. Certainly no evidence for this in the fossil record. And even this very famous case of Archaeopteryx does not count. Now, finally, let me refer to a very well-known evolutionist, Professor Colin Patterson, or Dr. Colin Patterson, a paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History in London. He's been a lifelong evolutionist. He published a book called Evolution several years ago. And when a friend of mine was in London, he picked up a copy of this book. And he wrote to Dr. Patterson. Patterson invited comments from the readers, so he wrote to Dr. Patterson. He said, Dr. Patterson, I enjoyed your book very much, but why don't you have some examples of actual transitional forms in your book? That would have been helpful, you see. Well, Dr. Patterson wrote back to my friend in a letter dated the 10th of April, 1979, thanked him for his letter, and then he said, and I quote, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, either among the fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. End of quote. Here is a scientist, a paleontologist, a man who'd been a lifelong evolutionist, and he said, you're right, I don't have examples of actual transitional forms in my book, but if I had known of any, I certainly would have included them. And he's sitting among one of the greatest collection of fossils in the world. I think that says volume. We see then that as we examine the evidence from various fields of science, from thermodynamics, probability relationships, and the fossil record, the evidence demands creation.